welcome. Thank you for joining us today for one of the final workshops of the 2021 Youth WA KickstART Festival. And today's workshop is Astrophotography with Samuel Chan. First of all, I want to make an acknowledgement of country and acknowledge that this festival and this workshop takes place on our Budja, and that we acknowledge the ownership and are grateful for the custodianship of the people who originate from the Whadjuk nation. And we also extend that acknowledgement to traditional owners of country throughout Australia. We pay our respects to elders past and present, and we're committed to the reconciliation and supporting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people. And without much further ado, I want to introduce, some of you may see that there's two accounts called Samuel Chan on here, but there is only one Samuel Chan who's joining us today. Thank you, Samuel, for joining us, and I'll let you take it away from here.
Sweet. So hey, how's everyone? I'm Sam. So I've been astrophotographer for a year. I've been practicing astrophotography while everyone was practicing social distancing. Since we're out in the open, and then we'll be all on our own. So I learned astrophotography on the Perth Observatory with Roger Groom, and here I am with an astrophotography workshop. First of all, there are different kinds of astrophotography. There's some capturing planetary. There's deep space, which I haven't done yet because I don't have the necessary equipment for it. Capturing meteors, star trails, and of course the previous slide, which was the Milky Way. A lot of different things to shoot, and each of them have their own forms of method to shoot. So just be mindful of all that. There are a couple of things just to bear in mind is that astrophotography is an art and science in general. So there's a lot of practice going on. So the left image is actually my very first shot of the Milky Way that was captured last year. This was shot at Point Island in Mandurah. And then the second Milky Way shot was one on a tracker. So you can see you can't really see on the presentation, but if you actually zoom in closer, it's very, very sharp. So, and I was using a tracker. So this was shot at the Perth Observatory with Roger Groom himself. So it takes a bit of practice, but if you're able to learn and to keep practicing over and over, eventually you'll be able to master it pretty fast, since this was maybe 2 months apart. Yeah, and that was technically my second shoot. So yeah. First of all, you need to know what equipment you have. You need DSLR or mirrorless, or any form of camera that's able to shoot manual. So I think some compact cameras can actually shoot manual. Just do a bit of a long exposure. I do understand some phones are able to change the shutter speed so that you're able to do long exposures. So actually phones can sometimes do it. Maybe just like a one exposure basic shot of the Milky Way. You also need a lens. So bear in mind, there are some lenses that you can't really use. That image up there is probably the wrong kind of lenses. So for example, this camera at the back, I do have a 24 to 70 mil. This one is actually a very, very heavy lens. And I've tried astrophotography many times with it. And because it's really heavy, the weight of balance is too far forward. So when it's on a tripod, it kind of shakes a lot. So you have to bear in mind with the technical side of things. First of all, can I ask, maybe if you can put down in the chat as well, what kind of camera do you guys currently own? If you can mention in the chat as well. It's all right, Nikon 5500. That's a nice camera, actually. Oh, Canon R6, RF, rocking the mirrorless. And, okay, that's a new camera. I think that's a compact. I think. Interesting. Sweet. Okay. Oh, M50. Nice. So the M50 is a compact mirrorless. So that one is a crop camera, which is actually not bad. But you can definitely do astrophotography with it. I just need to make sure, Natalia, if your Canon can do manual. If it's able to do manual, it should be able to. If you're able to switch lenses, even greater. Because the wider the lens, because when you do landscape photography, you want to shoot everything. So you want a wide lens to be able to equip on it. And I know that not every form of photography would use wide lens. Cool. So now that we got cameras out of the way, so I'll be able to talk through some features if you have any questions at the very end of the workshop regarding settings, because I will go through quite a few settings features for Canon, Sony, and Nikon. I've actually used all three. Yeah. So, okay. So with the lenses, there are different kinds. So depending on what kind of astrophotography you're shooting, the lens will be able to, is the first thing you need to have in mind for that form. So if you're shooting Milky Way wide and doing landscaping, you want a wide lens, or you can go to a max of like 35 mil. It's okay. If you're doing deep space, you need a telephoto lens. Bear in mind that you also need a tracker. So down on the equipment list, I did give you guys a rough estimate of how much it will cost for the additional equipment on some places. And if you're shooting star trails, you can go a bit more narrow. So you can go to like 40 plus mil. But too narrow, you won't get much of space, and you do want to kind of frame your shots a bit more. So that's with lenses. I primarily go for a prime lens, so something that's one length, because it's the shorter it is, the less weight it will have, so it won't protrude too much. That way you won't have that shake. So with that Tamron lens that I showed you, 24 mil is a great length to use, but it's really long, and on top of that, it's really heavy. And with the mirrorless is light, so it's like shaking a lot, and you won't be able to get that long exposure because you're doing 30 seconds exposure, and it will be shaking during that. So even if it's not windy, it still has that slight motion due to the fact that it's very heavy in the front. So you need a sturdy tripod. Roger Groom would recommend a carbon fiber tripod, but that's just bear in mind, carbon fiber is a very expensive tripod. You could go for aluminum. Most astrophotographers won't actually recommend aluminum, but you could go for aluminum. And if you grab a bunch of sandbags, you can weigh it down, so you bring its center of gravity down. That way you're able to cut costs as well. So I will also help you guys cut costs on some equipment, because when you do astrophotography, it's a very expensive hobby. So the three other equipment that I put down, the lower ones with the smaller font, are actually optional. So you don't actually really need them, which is the remote shutter release. Remote shutter release allows you to expose your shot longer than 30 seconds, because every camera will only do a max of 30 seconds. And then after that, we bulb, which you have to hold down that shutter. The remote shutter release will allow you to extend that and even time it. So you can do a time, or you can just press and hold and then just release whenever you want to. You don't exactly need it, depending which camera you're getting, right? If it comes with the Bluetooth, say if you've got a Canon, so I know there are a couple of Canon users here. So the Canon app actually allows you to press and hold and then release, and then it will just count. And then when you're done with it, you just press again, and then you finish the exposure. So that's the Canon camera app. That's the standard one. So it's actually up to $40 on DigiDirect. You can get the shutter release. Lens warmer and heater strips is quite compulsory when you come to winter. If you're shooting before midnight, okay, that should be fine. You can get away with it. But because it gets really cold, so I actually did some star trails for you guys to show. 2 nights ago, but I did it after 2 a.m. So I was going from 2 a.m. to 5 a.m. and it dropped down to like 5 degrees. And then like an hour later, my lens actually fogged up because I don't actually own a lens warmer heater strip. So it fogged up and then I wasn't there to see it fog. So like I was doing star trail, so that'll be like 500 frames. So 400 frames was kind of wasted. So you're wasting like 400 clicks and then you're leaving the camera on for 4 hours and not realizing that it's actually a complete fail. Star Tracker is going to be the most expensive thing you'll be buying alongside your camera, body, lens, and tripod, because you will be setting the camera to move according to the sky. So if you notice, when you shoot up in the sky, it is slowly moving. So actually, the sky rotates every hour, 15 degrees. So that'll be a total of 23 hours, I think, that it makes a full rotation. So just bear in mind that like in a couple of seconds, it would have moved like maybe a millimeter. And every 30 seconds, it'll move a millimeter. That's more accurate. And it will affect your shot depending because of the sensitivity your camera will have when doing that exposure. So the Star Tracker is there to help you be able to follow the sky so that you're able to do a stack. So what I'm going to be talking about later will be how to stack your shots as well to clean and to noise reduce, because not a lot of people will know about noise reduction. I've met a lot of astrophotographers who do one exposures, but didn't realize that there is an option of doing stacking. So the Star Tracker, the cheapest I've ever found was $475, which was on Amazon, I think. Sweet. Okay, extra tips on what to bring for the shoot. Remember to stay warm. It's very, very cold at night, during winter especially. If you're shooting in the summer, insect repellent is a must. I cannot tell you how many times I got attacked by mosquitoes from sunset to dusk. We were like running around everywhere and we slapping ourselves. We look like clowns out there. Luckily, no one else was there to see us, or else that'll be pretty embarrassing. So you need light because you'll be walking in the dark, definitely. I would recommend a red light torch because white light and red light's actually dimmer. If you've noticed, when you shine a red light in the room and compare it to white light, red light's dimmer. So usually when you're with a bunch of astrophotographers and you're shooting, the white light will be, it's like a high beam on a car, you know? So when you do a red light, it's low, dimmer, so it won't affect other people's shots, because I've met a lot of astrophotographers who get fussy, and then you'll be like shining a white light and they'll be telling you to turn it off because they're doing an exposure while you're trying to figure out your camera settings. So I do also highly recommend to be familiar with your camera before you actually shoot. Safety first is also another must. Bring a bodyguard. How many times have I seen druggies out in the bush and not sure what they're planning to do, especially you got such expensive equipment on you. Preparation and planning. So there are a lot of things to actually be mindful of. First of all, let me turn this off. Time, day, month, and weather is the first thing, and cloud cover. So the time, you need to be aware of when the Milky Way, depending what you're shooting. If you're shooting star trails, okay, that can be technically all night long. The moon has its own rotation, so it will come and it will rise and set, just like the sun. So you also need to bear in mind what time that moon comes out or when that drops. You need to also know when, because the Earth is rotating, the Milky Way is also moving. So you need to know what time the Milky Way is over the horizon or under the horizon. So actually for day and month, if you're shooting Milky Way, there is a Milky Way season, right? So the Milky Way season is actually mid-autumn to mid-spring. So it's April to October. That's for everyone that's here in Australia and in America as well, if you're no matter where you are. But just bear in mind, if your northern hemisphere is on the west side from April to October. If you're on the southern hemisphere, for us, it's on the eastern side. So it rotates. You also need to bear in mind moon phases and duration, how long you'll be shooting out there. So you need to plan that, because how many times have I gone out like 3-hour drive and then you're shooting for a long time and you probably won't let anybody know where you are, and they'll be wondering what time you're coming home. So there's also moon phases as well to bear in mind. Sorry, I'm kind of all over the place, am I? Yeah, sorry, I'm just going to ignore that notes now. So you also need, before you go out, just know how long you'll be shooting, when you'll be shooting, and you also need to know the weather as well. So the weather is quite compulsory. When there's a lot of clouds, you don't want to have, you can't really shoot the sky, can you? First of all, but when there's clouds, say it's like partly cloudy, you still can get away with it when doing Milky Way shots. I've seen a lot of very nice images where Milky Way and clouds kind of coexist together, which is actually really nice. Star trails, on the other hand, if there's any like clouds passing by, you might as well forget it. Don't waste your shutter clicks, because the clouds will actually go right across, especially when you stack it. So it will stack over in layers, like because you're stacking in stars to go around. So the clouds will actually go like this as well. So you technically lose the night sky completely with the clouds. So just also bear in mind cloud cover and also other weather such as thunder, rain. You don't want to get your equipment wet as well. Moon phases is another thing that you also need to bear in mind. If it's a full moon, there's going to be a lot of light pollution. So it's going to cast a lot of light everywhere. And you're not able to capture the Milky Way, or if you're shooting nebulas, galaxies, or Magellanic clouds, you're not going to get a lot of good exposures because the moon is going to be shining a lot onto you. However, you can get away with going like crescent moons or half moons, because we like to play around with the moons as well, the moonlight. So the moonlight, if you're shooting complete at night and you're not going to do any form of other composition, we usually use the moon to light up our foreground. So that's a tip, right? So, but we don't usually go for full moon because that will kind of like create a huge light pollution over, and that's why you travel 3 hours away from the city, right? We're going to try and avoid light pollution so you get clearer skies. So that's one way to go with the moon. If you're shooting a full moon, say like if you're shooting the moon itself, you want to have more of a moon rather than crescent moon or a half moon. I mean, a half moon is quite nice, but I would go for a full moon if I can. But yeah, just bear in mind that the moon can affect your astrophotography. So just bear in mind that. Navigation. So you need to know where you're going. So I have a list of places that you could go. So nearby and out and like really far away here in WA. So I'll talk about that in a bit. Composition is also another thing to bear in mind, because you want to be interesting with your shot. You want to know your framing, you want to know what you're shooting. So you kind of got to plan ahead. Maybe do some scouting, go on Google Maps, check out places, see similar photos, and then you'll be able to find forms of composition so that when you actually drive there and get there, you know what you're shooting. So you don't want to waste time figuring out. Believe me, I've wasted plenty of time going out there and trying to figure out what I'm shooting, only to realize the thing I want to shoot is already over the horizon, so it's gone. So just make sure to plan before you go. So that's the primary thing. So here are some resources of metro locations to go to do astrophotography. So Lake Clifton is in Mandurah. It's a very nice place. I've actually shot there a couple of times. In fact, I want to go back down there maybe in August, because that's when the Milky Way is not too high so late. The Golden View Lookout at South Ledge at Mundering Weir is another place. So Mundering Weir, Serpentine Dam, etc. Often need to walk, but not usually a problem with doing so. Just bear in mind that. Lake Leschenolztia, I hope I pronounced that right, is also another place that's further inland. It's a nice place. I've actually never been there, but a lot of my friends say it's a good place to shoot. Boulder Rock and Mount Dale, just be aware that of your surroundings, because it is also a pretty dangerous place, especially if you're walking around at night. Coastal areas is good for playing around with conjunctions and also experimenting with star trails and other forms of astrophotography. So that could be like Point Perrin, Trigg, and other beaches with reef formations, Woodman Point, and Coogee. So you can play around with that as well. So star trails is actually pretty nice to shoot over a water landscape, because you can sometimes, because when you do long exposures, you can get reflection sometimes. So that's usually on lakes, but in beach, sometimes when you play around, and then you get that nice long exposures of the beach, but you also get a composition of like star trails going over the horizon, which is actually really nice. In fact, I'll show you some images later. Kings Park, Bold Park, and South Park are common places for moon eclipse and city compositions. So with my previous one, so the one on the left, that one is in Kings Park. I was actually trying to do star trails. If you actually zoom in really close, you can actually see stars right there, because I was trying to shoot star trails, but it kind of stuffed up because I was using the wrong lens. But I was lucky enough to shoot that comet, that fireball in the sky going down, which was really cool. Me and my friend would just stare at it and just start swearing because we didn't know what to say completely. City lookouts. I would recommend, if it's a good place, I'd like Lions Lookout or Welshpool Road Lookout. That's some nice places where to play around with the city, especially since the city is quite far away, so the light is not that destructive. I've not had a successful shoot yet, but my friends have already had one, so I definitely can recommend saying it's a good place to shoot. Rottnest Island is also another great place to shoot, even though I've never been to Rottnest Island, period. But the recommendation is if you shoot away from the city, so if you shoot west on Rottnest Island, and then you play around with astrophotography over like the plain big ocean, that's amazing to try out as well. Okay, so country locations. Here are some country locations. Here, these places, no problems with light pollution. I probably won't mention them all. So this was all recommended by Roger Groom from Perth Observatory back in 2020. I did add in relatively nearby areas, Lancelin Sand Dunes. He didn't put Lancelin Sand Dunes down there, but I can definitely say Lancelin Sand Dunes has some great opportunities to do astrophotography over like a desert, which is interesting composition. So, I mean, like if you have, at the end of the workshop, if you guys missed and want to take a screenshot or take notes of these locations, feel free to let me know. I'll bring up that slide again. Okay, checking for light pollution. This is a great website to check where all the light pollution is. So I'll leave it to you guys to put it down in your notes. And next one. So it's darksidefinder.com. Bear in mind that it will do the entire world. So you do need to punch in Australia, and then you get Australia. Okay, now we're getting into the juicy part. We're going into shooting. So camera settings. That's the greatest bit that you need to know. Without this, you probably won't be shooting much. First of all is file format. We usually shoot at RAW. So you're able to get the best information data from that image. I'd also recommend JPEG sometimes, especially when doing star trails, because imagine shooting 400 images of RAW and you're trying to stack all of them together. And if you don't have the best computer with you, that's going to be really hard. So just remember, if you're shooting star trails or if you're doing time lapse, I'd go JPEG to compress the file so it's not too large. Or you could go JPEG RAW and try and reduce it as much as you can. But I wouldn't recommend RAW if equipment is not a luxury to you. Shutter speed is the next camera settings to bear in mind. Depending on what you're shooting, you will need to adjust the shutter speed. You're never going to be shooting below 250. You're going to be shooting, say, I think for astrophotography, you're going to be shooting 15 seconds or longer. So just bear in mind that your camera must be able to shoot that long on shutter speed. Aperture is another thing. The wider the aperture, the more light will come in. So just bear in mind of that as well. The narrower the aperture, sure, you may be able to flatten the image, but you want as much light as you can. So usually we don't allow to narrow more than 7, f-stop 7. So you want to go from f-stop 7 to 1.8 as wide as you can. ISO is another thing. You're going to be wanting to pump up the ISO really high. But just bear in mind that that includes a lot of noise. So, but if you're doing star trails, I've been recommended to lower the ISO a little bit, as much as you can, because then you'll be able to saturate it even more. White balance is another thing to bear in mind. And not a lot of people actually talk about white balance. First of all, with white balance for landscape shots, I usually recommend to do custom Kelvin. So that'll be 4800 Kelvin. Because if you look into the sky and then shoot your camera at 4800 Kelvin, you'll be able to notice that what you see with the naked eye and on the camera will be the same color. That's as close as you can to see with the naked eye. A lot of people like to experiment down to like 3600K, which is actually warmer. But yeah, I'd also recommend to kind of shoot at 4800. If your camera does not have custom Kelvin, daylight white balance is another thing to use. Or you can even use, I think some people said they were able to use, what is it? Let me just check. A sec. So tungsten light as well. It uses 3200K approximately. Now, there's another feature that a lot of people don't actually think about, which is noise reduction features. Most cameras will actually have those. So the screenshot that you're seeing right down the bottom right, that's what you see on a Nikon camera. So just make sure that your long exposure NR is off or at low. Oh, sorry, that one's off. And then high ISO NR will be either low or off. That's probably the lowest you want it to have. So what long exposure and high ISO NR actually do is that after you take the shot, because you're shooting it longer than 15 seconds, right? So it will try to process it and will try to remove all the noise. But then because remember the sky is also moving very fast, right? So like every 30 seconds, it'll be moving a millimeter to a centimeter. And while it's doing that processing, that sky is moving. So you want to beat it. So that's why we encourage to actually turn it off. And then there's actually a method to noise reduce it where that in post-production. Okay, so I did mention that for star trails, the popular white balance is actually 3600 to 4500 Kelvin. So just bear that in mind as well. Okay, when you shoot, we astrophotographers actually use the rule of 500. I'm not sure how many of you guys know the rule of 500. I mean, you can put your hands up if you know. The rule of 500 is more of a guideline. So I actually put down, I've written here like the basic information to help you guys out. So the rule of 500 is a guideline for ideal shutter speed to avoid trailing. So if you're shooting Milky Way, you don't want to have a lot of trailing because after you stack or when you put it on, your Milky Way will be kind of blurry because it's actually moving within that 30 seconds exposure or 20-second exposure, depending which lens you're using. So, but it's only star trails where you want it to have the most trailing as possible. So you'll be shooting 30 seconds to a minute or so. So the use of 500, a rule is only done if you're shooting time lapse because you want it smooth, or if you want to shoot Milky Way or deep space like nebula, Magellanic Clouds, galaxies, and the moon or planets. I forgot to mention that. So right down below, so it would be 5. So you'll be doing because, all right. So I put some examples. So with the Canon 90D, which is this camera I have right here. So I'm using a 14mm lens, which is this one here. So this is a Samyang 14mm. It's a pretty wide lens, but bear in mind that the Canon 90D is crop. So it's not a true 14mm. So that's why I have here 90D with a 14mm. So you'll be going 1.6 times 14. And then you divide using that number, you would divide 500. and then you get the closest ideal shutter, and then you just round it down to, or round it up to the closest shutter speed that the camera offers. So yeah, with the rule of 500, you're technically using the focal length and dividing 500 with that. Sony A7 III is a full frame, so you don't exactly need to times with the crop to the focal length, so you don't actually need to do that. So I did put down in smaller text, note crop factors, because depending which camera you have, they will have a different crop factor. So full frame is a full frame, so you don't need, you'll be multiplying it by 1, which is going to be the same number. So Sony, Nikon, and Fujifilm, etc., would be a crop factor of 1.5. Canon, unfortunately, is 1.6, so your lens is actually narrower compared to a Nikon, Sony, or Fujifilm if you have Canon. So just also be mindful of that. So let me just check on the chat for those who mentioned which lens, which camera they're using. So Arif, with the R6, it's a full frame. You won't be multiplying that by anything. The EOS M50, even though it's a mirrorless, Jamie, it's actually going to be a crop camera. So you'll be actually shooting at 1, so your crop factor of 1.6. I have a feeling the Canon SX is actually also a crop, so you'll be multiplying that by 1.6 as well. Nikon 5500, I believe that's a crop as well. But Esther, if it is full frame, let me know. We'd be interested as well. Yeah, so there are also other cameras, micro four thirds cameras. So they'll be doing a crop factor of 2. It's going to be really narrow. And there's compact cameras with 1-inch type sensors. It's going to be 2.7 or higher. So also be mindful of that, whichever camera you're using. Okay, framing. So we're going to use rule of thirds. We always try to, I think most of you who know photography will be shooting with rule of thirds and also leading lines. You'll be noticing of all that kind of compositions. But of course, most of the time when you do like landscape photography, you're going to be trying to get the landscape and you want less sky, because more sky is like a lot of negative space, depending if it's cloudless. So you'll be shooting down, but for astrophotography, you'll be pointing up. So here's an example, a rough estimate of a rule of thirds. I just put a bunch of lines on one of my photos that I took at, where was this? Point Heron. Point Heron is a nice place to shoot. I actually want to go back there again, actually, now that I think about it. So, yep. When using star trails, just also bear in mind how much sky you have, and you apply rule of thirds and leading lines as well. It makes a much more interesting photo of stars, for sure. Okay, where are you shooting? Now, this is one thing that a lot of people use. They actually use apps or they go on Google. You will definitely find a lot of information like that. I, on the other hand, when I started astrophotography, I was running around with a Nokia phone. I didn't have much equipment to read the sky. So I actually had to look at the stars and actually figure out where am I shooting. Because depending where you're shooting, say I'm here down in Kwinana, and you can actually still get away with some Milky Way shots, but you won't be able to really see it with the naked eye. That's why it's a nice thing to have a camera where it's able to shoot longer exposures and you're able to see the Milky Way, which you can't really see with your own eye. When shooting with the galactic center, we always look for the constellation of Scorpius. It's usually around there, and then a bit further down from that image will be Sagittarius A, which is the galactic center. I'm not sure how many of you guys have actually went to Zal's workshop on Monday. I didn't actually go. I actually wanted to go, actually, but I was working. I'm pretty sure he was talking about stars and constellations from the description I read. If Arif can confirm that for me. So if you're doing star trails, so with the two different constellations and measurements I have on the right side of this slide, this is to figure out where you're shooting for star trails. So the top one is to find the northern celestial pole. So, you know, when the Earth rotates, right? All the stars are moving, but there'll be two stars, which will be at the North Pole and the South Pole, which will be static. So the Earth is rotating along that. So the Big Dipper and its pointers would be pointing towards the northern celestial pole. So if you're in the northern hemisphere, if you want circles in your star trails, that is what you'd be looking for. For us Aussies down in the southern hemisphere, we're shooting the southern celestial pole. So what you're looking for is the Southern Cross and then Alpha and Beta Centauri, and then create a perpendicular line until they meet, and that's the southern celestial pole. A lot of people would think that the southern celestial pole is an easy star to find. Now, it's actually not very easy to look because it's actually not that bright. Surprisingly, most people will say, "Oh, the northern star and light and this is is a huge bright star," but the southern star is not bright. So yeah, so you have to use the Southern Cross and Alpha and Beta Centauri to find it. Surprisingly enough, there are two Magellanic clouds to the right, so you could shoot. That could be some points of interest to shoot as well. Normally, when we do astrophotography, we're not always shooting Milky Ways, star trails, and deep space points of interest. Sometimes you'll just be interested in just shooting specific constellations because they do make interesting formations, especially when you have an interesting foreground to shoot. Say if you're on a hill or something, that'd be kind of interesting. So where the points of interest, the circle will form there. So you do need to also be mindful that trees could be blocking that circle, depending where you're shooting. So you do need to adjust until you're able to see that point very clearly in the sky. You can actually shoot the northern celestial pole star trails from the south. You're going to get rainbows instead. So it's also pretty interesting. So in the next slide, there are different kinds of star trails. So these are all shot by me, all in my house. So the top one that's facing the southern celestial pole. So if I was to pick one frame, you'll be able to actually see the Southern Cross somewhere probably on the left-hand side where it's brightest, and it rotates over. And to the bottom left image is going to be southwest. Yeah. So southwest, if you shoot more west, you're going to get these kind of shapes where it will be like raining stars, but it will kind of start to distort in the corners as it tries to form into a rainbow or into a circle for us in the southern hemisphere. On the right image, I actually shot that only 156, so that's about an hour and a half. So it's actually not very full. Most star trails that when you look it up online, there are some amazing star trails out there. If you're wondering how they're able to create such beautiful colors, it's because they're actually shooting around 6 hours. So I actually have not shot something for that long yet. Actually, I do have one image, but I haven't edited that one yet. So I won't actually be able to show, but I do have some examples in this presentation as well. Concept of stacking, right? So concept of stacking is going to be used when you're noise reducing. Sure, you can actually take one exposure, but if you want to be able to reduce noise, you'll be using the concept of stacking and processing your images. So what is stacking? Stacking is taking an image of one object multiple times with the same exposure settings. You stack them together to create one image, and then it creates a profile of the noise because the noise is actually moving. You close your eyes, right? And you'll notice these red, blue, and green dots flying around beneath your eyelids. That is also noise. So the camera is very sensitive, especially with a high ISO. It's going to be really sensitive to that noise. So it creates a profile because you can't actually copy and paste the images because the noise is the same. what it needs to have is the noise moving around. So it needs to have an average of the amount of noise to stack. So usually we go 14 to 20 of the same exposure and then stack it together to create a clean image. So the bottom right is an example of a single image stacked with 2 images, stacked with 5 images, and then stacked with 30 images. The more images you stack, the more cleaner it will be. Noise reducing stacking can be also applied to low light photography, just to let you know as well. When you're doing low light landscape, I don't think you'll have time to do low light profile photos of people and stuff like that, because it's going to be really hard, especially when the target is moving. So just also bear that in mind as well. Calibration frames. So this is when you turn off your high ISO NR. What the high ISO noise reduction features on your camera is actually doing is creating dark profiles, bias profiles, flat and dark flat. I'm actually not going to talk too much about this because I did mention in this workshop, I'll be talking about the basics. This is actually more advanced because you don't exactly, when you are shooting several images and they stack it, you're already kind of calibrating with multiple light frames together. But if you want to make it even more perfect and to improve your image quality even more, you'll be calibrating your images with these frames. So light frames is what you see when you shoot. Bias and dark frames is what you do. Say dark frames is technically the same exposure. What you're doing is you're putting the lid over your camera. And then it creates a noise profile of the conditions back during that time. Because every time you shoot, the noise actually changes because the noise is static, it's moving around. So you won't be able to know if, so it won't be under the same conditions depending, because when it's hot, the noise will actually be in a different state. When it's cold, same as well. So I won't be talking too much about calibrating frames, but just to summarize, photos you take under certain conditions and certain ways, you'll be using calibration frames to improve that, but you must shoot them in the same condition and in the same way to improve the quality of your light frames. So the calibration frames will remove different kinds of noise, vignetting, and dust and imperfections in your optical setup, because you're going to have maybe smudges on your lens, or there will be dust inside, specks of dust. So that will also affect your astro shot. But I guess to summarize, bias frames will remove noises in the sensor. Dark frames will remove will record the electronic noise that is picked up when you shoot. So if you want to go ahead, dark frames is also an easier one to use, is the first step. And then you can go further with flat and dark flat. But even I have not used flat and dark flat. I've just done bias and dark frames. Most editing softwares will include those two frames concept to stack. So depending what softwares you use, they will allow you to do that. Mean and median stack modes. So that's going to be the next step after shooting. So this is when you get home, and then you need to understand the mean and median stack modes, right? So just to summarize the mean and median stack modes, it's the mean is the average of pixels. So if you had, so say you're stacking with 10 layers, 9 were red and pixels and 1 is blue. The mean would consist of 9 parts red and 1 part blue. This will soften the image as it blends the color of each stacked pixel to find the average color tone and show the average pixel. So just to summarize, mean is good for soft, long exposures because it will stack And median does try to neaten and increase the details because it is the average. It is the middle. We'll give you the middle. So the middle value is the color that outweighs the others. So we'll only see whichever has the most color pixel in it. So just to let you know that when you're doing stacking, if you have Photoshop will definitely have a lot of stacking involved. So just to let you know that median stack is what you'd be using for astrophotography. I will drop some links down as well for resources on if you want to learn more about this. There are some good websites, and I do have some of the links, so I can also send them to you if you need more information. Editing. Okay. Right, so editing, we're only going to be covering a few things. So we don't want to go overboard with editing for beginner. I mean, unless if you're more experienced and you want to be creative, go ahead. But usually you don't want to corrupt too much of what you're able to capture through your camera. So usually we're just covering curves. So I'm going to be leaving this presentation for a second to show you my thing, if I can. Okay, cool. Still able to see? Yeah. So down here, when you're shooting, so this is what you're capturing with Star Trail. So this is just in my backyard with the 14mm on the Sony a7 III. If you zoom in, there's a Southern Cross, and there's Alpha. Nope. Yep, that's Alpha Alpha Centauri, and Beta Centauri is behind the tree. When you shoot, it's gonna be moving ever so slightly. So then you have to create this kind of star trails. So this is about 180. So this is about 1 hour before I started the fog up. So this was when I was trying to shoot for you guys. So when you're editing, you don't want to go too overboard. So to create something maybe like this, just to boost the saturation, increase the light a little bit. If you increase too much, it can start to affect and will start to overlap with each other. And right here is what I've used. Just remove this. Yep, okay, cool. So what I did was, if I was to remove some curves, levels, and vibrance. So when I increased the vibrance, what I did was I technically brought up all the way to max, because I had intended to remove most of the foreground. If you're including a lot of foreground and you increase the saturation, it's going to start affecting what's ever in front, because, okay, there are some frames involved in this where it does fog up a little bit. So it's the blue pixels that some of the trees will turn blue because the trees start to feather as it blurs because of the fog. So, but because I wasn't too worried about it, I increased the saturation and vibrancy as much as possible because it doesn't seem to affect the trees too much. For levels, what most people actually try to do is they try not to go too overboard, because say if you bring it up really high, see how blurry it is because of when it was fogged. So usually I just bring it back to, oh shoot, 1. Just leave it as normal with the gamma. So what we're doing is usually playing around with the histogram up here. So normally it would look like this, right? Well, because you see how much negative space, how much black pixels there are here, mainly dunes around here, is actually a lot of wasted colors. So what we usually do is we bring the white level up a bit until it's at a good point. So we usually point at when it starts to pick up a little bit. So that's what we usually do. You can go a bit further if you want to play around, but usually I brought it down around here, so just not too destructive. And then when you include the curves, you're usually not going too overboard with the curves. I did kind of go overboard for me because I was trying to reduce, to add more red pixels in the star trails. So, but usually for like master, you're only increasing a little bit. In other forms of photography, you want to increase a lot of contrast. But with star trails, you kind of don't want to go too overboard with contrasting, because you could destroy the differences that's already been created with your image. So, I mean, if you're able to play around with it, by all means. So we're going to be, this is the stacked photo of the Milky Way that I shot at Perth Observatory. So I'm going to be just showing a little bit. So the software I'm using is called Affinity Photos. So surprising enough, I'm actually not an Adobe user. We just good on time. Yep. So I'm just going to play around with it. So with levels, see the amount of black pixels is over here. And there's actually a lot of black pixels over here as well. So we're going to bring up the black levels as well and see how it just brings. Of course, it does increase a lot of vignetting, which you can also fix that in post-production. You can bring it down, and where it starts to pick up maybe around here so that we don't see too much, so we don't get overboard, because if you go too far in, it kind of destroys a bit too much, and then your light pixels will kind of go. So I'll bring it around here, and then with the same, I'll do the same on this side. So it's kind of like that. And you just play around with it until it looks to your fancy. See how much it has changed. You don't want to blow out too much here, because sometimes some people like to see a lot of shapes, but sometimes I don't mind blowing out a little bit. But I'll actually start around here, and I'll bring this around. I'm just going to bring that around here. Normally you can do a bit of coloring. So actually with, can I go back to this presentation? Yep, cool. I did change the colors quite drastically on this. So it's not something to be too afraid of it playing around. Roger Groom himself would actually recommend to not go too overboard for beginners, but usually if you're changing color, sometimes you want to see something. Just imagine, just get creative and think about what you would want to see, really. So just to show as well the stacking here. If I get a bit boring, let me know. I think someone's mic is still on. Okay, cool. So yeah, with this one, I'm not sure how many of you guys came to my exhibit last night. We did, Propel Youth Arts did have an exhibit for 4 different photographers. I was one of them. So this was actually one photo that I actually used. So I actually did a bit of soft proofing. I added a bit of soft proofing to kind of fix it. But what I really played around was the curves. So if I turn this off, so that's just to increase a bit of saturation, but I try not to go too hard onto the saturation. I also kind of affect the Milky Way shape. You'll notice a lot of masking layers here because I'm playing around the foreground, especially since, okay, fun fact, that Milky Way is actually not there. That Milky Way, if I was to shoot normally, that Milky Way is actually higher up, but then there's a moon right in front of it. So you won't be able to shoot the Milky Way at all. So that Milky Way was actually shot in Mandra. And what I did was I played around with it and I placed it. So if I was to remove it, it would look like that. Let me put it back on. That's how it looks. I actually did a lot of masking and I did set it on a pass-through blend. So you can also put it like, so just play around with blends. So when you change the blend, it will look like that. So say screen, lighten, see how it changes. So I do have a video clip of someone who summarizes blending modes really well within 60 seconds. So it won't take too much of your time to see that video. And with the live stacking mode, so I actually had, so what I actually did was if you zoom in, when it processes, okay, slide process. Maybe because I got too many softwares open. So actually what happens is that has a lot of noise because I had the ISO pumped up because I actually shot it during blue hours. So it was like really dark, way beyond dusk already. And if I was to increase the shutter speed, like make it longer, my brothers in the screen will be moving a lot and they'll get blurry. So what I did was I made the shutter speed as fast as I could without getting them blurred out, increase the ISO really high, widen the aperture as much as I can, and I just spam it. So if you look down here, I have roughly 35 images and I stacked them together to noise reduce. So this was using the median blend, which I did roughly explain. And if you want to have more details, I do have the resource links as well to help further clarify on that. Now we're just going to go back here. Something's, oh, yeah, okay, cool. It's just bouncing. Be creative. So in this image, I kind of like remember to plan your compositions, as I mentioned in the beginning, but what would inspire you to create what composition? So this was actually what I tried doing. It's kind of weird. In fact, I don't think I'll upload this on Instagram, since it has a very awkward positioning, framing and everything, but because there's so much trees in my backyard, I couldn't be able to see the skies clear enough without having to try to do a proper profile shot of myself. And I was just shooting this by myself. So yeah, I just saw this in anime and I was like, why not? I haven't seen anybody try this on Google, you know? It's like everyone who shoots it is like with Milky Ways, but not with star trails. So why not try with star trails? So you kind of be creative and you can just want to try things out, experiment. But just make sure you plan as careful as you can, or else you're wasting a lot of shutter clicks and you're also wasting a lot of time and you don't want to waste that. But of course, it's great to learn from people's mistakes, right? So you can learn from my mistake. So if you're curious about how I actually shot that image, what I actually did was, that's actually a day to night. So I actually didn't shoot that myself at night. I actually shot that in the morning when the sun was pretty high up already. Because when you're shooting me with the aperture so wide, it's going to be, the field of depth will be very different. So what I actually did was I had a camera tripod. You can't really see on this presentation because it's pretty dark down there, because I did grade it to be day to night. And I did have a tripod and a camera sitting there. And what I did was I did shoot one where it's focused on the camera and one where it's focused to the sky. So at infinite focal length. And then what you actually do is you actually do what you call a focus stack, focus merge, which merges it into a flat image where it's able to calibrate. So if you have Photoshop or you have Affinity Photo, it will have those features. So you'll be able to do a focus merge, and then you can add yourself later in, and then you just do a bit of masking and playing around. Okay, so we're going to be deconstructing. So this is a very nice image. This is done by Chungi Photos on Instagram. I can send you a link if you guys want to follow him on Instagram. He is based in Sydney. Very nice guy, and he has very nice photography. So he actually, so I'm going to deconstruct these photos just to kind of give you a rough idea of where you'd be shooting, of what is the steps to shoot. So you'll notice in the foregrounds of both images, it is unnaturally bright. If you shoot at night, it's not going to be like that. So what he actually did was he actually shot it in the morning, right? And he just wait for specific lightings when the sun is rising, and then he will shoot it just to get that kind of situation. And with the star trails, that is actually a 6-hour star trail. So he's shooting from sunset to sunrise, and then the Milky Way, probably 3 frames, maybe, because it's quite smooth, maybe 14 frames of stacking. And then he will blend it. So that's where the median, mean, stack modes will come back in handy. And there's also the blend modes, which is screen, pass through, and lighten, where he would be using that. And of course, there'll be a lot of masking used. So if you have Photoshop and or Affinity Photo, they do allow masking. I did use a program called Emerge Pro earlier. It's not a very good software for astrophotography, but it does have its own masking, depending, because some softwares, okay, just an example, because sometimes the masking feature they have will be like in box masking, like what you have in a video editor. Photoshop and Affinity Photo allows you to be able to create the masking tool using a brush. So that's more handier, and you're able to feather it even more. And that's what he probably did. If you see down, I can't really point, in the horizon. So when the Milky Way is high up, you're able to blend it a bit without having to destroy, and then the light with the blend modes won't destroy the image because it's higher up. I left a list here of stacking editing softwares if no one has ever used them before, if no one has any. So I've left some with softwares that's specifically for Mac OS, because yeah, Mac OS, if you're a Mac OS user, you'll find that you have a lot of disadvantages because a lot of the free softwares are on Windows and Linux. So here's a list. I'll leave it to you guys to take a screenshot or write notes, and we can get moving. I will put a link down below how much they cost, because the prices I did check were US, so not accurate, since we're in Australia. Are we on time? Yep. Okay, it's 5:40. So this is blend modes, made easy by Ezra Cohen. So, okay, just be mindful that the blend modes he's talking about is for video editing, but because they can be applied to what I've shown you with the Milky Way, which was at the pinnacles in the previous image that I've shown.
Blending modes are one of my absolute favorite tools to use as an editor, so I wanted to take a second and break them down visually. Essentially, blending modes help you do four main things: make white pixels transparent, black pixels transparent, gray pixels transparent, and interpret the difference between pixels. Let's start with this first section of blending modes, which make white pixels transparent. More specifically, we're going to use the blending mode multiply. Watch how the black pixels stay intact while the whites disappear. This is super helpful for elements like masks or matte overlays. Now let's look at the blending modes which make blacks transparent. When we select lighten or screen, we see that all black pixels disappear while keeping our light pixels in perfect shape. This is especially useful for elements like my CRT fonts, tour visual elements, and more. In this third section, you'll see how we utilize film grains or texture files by using the blending mode hard light. These blending modes make grays transparent while keeping all that beautiful texture intact and helping it blend into your footage. And finally, this last section of blending modes works on the difference between pixels. See how these white pixels turn black as the white lines pass over them, or how the colors are inverted when we deal with saturated elements. This is a really useful tool when you're looking for more of a trippy effect or when you're digging for those happy accidents.
Cool. And yeah, that's to my end of the presentation, where I'm open up for Q&A in case I was not clear. Since this was my first workshop, so if I stumble a lot and I start talking about random stuff and I kind of go all over the place, just apologize for that. I did start a follow-up share Facebook group. I thought I'd just throw that in. There is the link down below, to kind of like, if you have any questions, I'll be able to continue on, like a continued discussion. And if I ever want to do some astro and I'm in the neighborhood around and you guys want to tag along, for sure, because when I learned astrophotography, it's easy just to just listen, but then you don't actually remember everything. So it's good to try it out as a practical, like kind of like driving. So I thought it would be a great idea to do a Facebook group where we could host like sometimes when we go out for shooting, and we can run through and see how much you guys have kind of gathered from what I could tell. If you're not on Facebook, I'm also on Instagram, and you can also contact me via email. So I thought I'll just quickly show some of the equipment. A lot of people will use different filters. Don't get too lost with filters. That's usually just to get that nighttime feel. So usually they do like color filters and they put on their lens. You don't really need to get too gung-ho a lot about it. So I did have the Canon 90D and the Sony a7 III to mess around with. And I also did have the Nikon D7200 to mess around as well. Regarding lenses, I thought I might as well share. The 14mm. So this is the Samyang. Not sure if you're able to see. There we go. So this is the 14mm 2.8 f-stop 2.8 ED-AS-IF UMC. So this is roughly 500. I got it secondhand, so you'll be able to get it down to like 300 if you got it from secondhand. It's actually a really nifty lens. A lot of the star trails that you see and Milky Way was shot with this particular lens. With the moon image here. So with the moon, you want to go more telephoto. And I do have this lens here, which is I was lucky to have it because it's actually my grandfather's, and it's a 500mm Nikon lens. It is vintage as well. So it is a 1.8 aperture as well, the widest aperture. I'm not sure how much a lot of the vintage lens will sell these days, but you can get away with it because you're playing around with low light and you're doing a lot of post editing. So you don't have to go for the most expensive lens out there, really. You can also get away with the Nikon AF Nikkor that I have right here, which is a 20mm 2.8 f-stop. Yes, and I did show quite a few lenses, and they're actually on Nikon mounts. So I actually use this adapter from Gobe, which I thought I might as well share, since a lot of people who play around with adapters, they usually get worried about vignetting. Now, because you're also doing post editing, and you'll be, if you use like dark frames and the bias frames, you will be removing vignetting. And there's also some softwares which will help calibrate a little bit and help you remove the in-camera vignette. So you don't have to worry too much about vignetting with adapters. And it's also cheaper. You don't have to go too high. Since let me just bring this up. Actually, hold on. This one, this image was shot with the Samyang lens. This is a Nikon mount, right? And this adapter is a Nikon to Canon mount adapter. But I shot it on the Sony, right? So which is a different mount. So what I actually had was I used a different, okay, no worries, Esther. Different mount. So this is also from Gobe that I used. And so I don't. And I actually stacked two mounts together. If you look at the image, it's actually not too bad, right? There is still a bit of vignetting. Maybe you look over here, down over in this side. There's quite a huge vignetting. But because it does kind of draw the attention to specific areas, and especially if you're doing landscape, you don't want too much vignetting because you want the audience attention to spread throughout the entire image. But with astrophotography, sometimes the point of interest doesn't necessarily need to be the whole image, but rather like the Milky Way, which could be in the center. And then you just have the foreground to kind of lead your audience eyes into the subject. So I hope that actually helps. I'm not sure if anyone still have any questions. So I'll just leave that there, and I will drop all the resource links and places. If you guys do still want to have the links, the location resources, just let me know. I can also bring that up so you can take note as well. There's quite a lot of information to absorb, and that's why I thought, with more stuff, and if we can do like practicals, or if you're able to show me what you've done, and if you want more information, for sure I'll be able to help.
Yeah, we don't have to fill time necessarily. If people, excuse me one second. If people have, just wait a second. if people have any questions, they can ask questions. Do you have a question about astrophotography? No. But if anyone does have any questions, now's your time. But like otherwise, like there'll be a continuation on the Facebook group and things like that. Oh, thanks, Eric. Yeah, we're happy to. We can wrap it up early as well. We don't need to. Here we go. Here's a question from Sarah. Actually.
Oh yeah, have you done anything with the moon or any tips? Yeah, I've actually shot with the moon. So if you shoot, because sometimes you're really lucky when the moon is quite bright and it's quite large in the middle of the day, you can pump up your ISO a little bit and shoot. If you don't go too tight without the tracker, you could capture it as it goes a little bit, and then you do a merge stack. So some of the software. So one software I would recommend then would be, you could use Starry Landscape Stacker if you're on Mac OS, or Starry Sky Stacker. Or if you got Adobe Photoshop, for sure you can actually stack it, and it will have a automatic feature to kind of align the images, because the moon moves pretty fast. It actually moves faster than the Milky Way and stars. If you have a tracker, that's even greater. You can shoot even tighter onto the moon, and you just like tweak the tracker to follow the moon, and then you stack, and then yeah, try to go as long range as you can, because the moon can be pretty hard to capture when you're on wide lens. But yeah, hope that helps, Sarah. I can't wait to actually see all of your images when you finish. See what you guys come up. Get creative, guys.